Hello, yes, can you hear me okay?
Hey, how are you doing? Hello.
Yes, good, yeah, all right, so thank you.
We're just waiting on Michael for a second here.
Okay, cool, nice one.
He's late to his own party.
It must be that Austin Powers was the international man of mystery.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right, hang on. I don't know what's happening with my video.
He's also now displayed his entire name.
I trust you guys. I mean, Jack's got his full fucking name up.
Well, he's an academic. It's kind of required, right?
I love these, these academics that always post anonymously or write the paper without their real name. And I think to myself, can you imagine trying to get by not using their real name or something?
Yeah, you're lucky because your name already seems fake.
I know. Well, mate, I know. Yes, yeah.
We were actually going to ask you, how would you like us to broach the subject of Jack Black? Like, would you prefer a joke or?
Mate, I'm more than happy to take a joke. I think, yeah.
We were joking that it's similar to your experience of the racist joke with your coworker. Like there's that risk involved in making a joke about your name, like not knowing how you'll receive it.
No, I know. And it's amazing how people completely and utterly cock it up as well. So I've had people obviously clearly not very bright people say were you named after him type thing and stuff like that. I'm like, well, no, the years don't work out. Plus, no, that's not the case. But do you know what's even more frightening about our name connection?
What's that?
Is that we actually share the same birthday as well.
No way.
Okay,
that's so weird.
That's pretty trippy.
Weird. I know, isn't that
that's
weird?
Like a Jungian archetype shit.
I know. And there's the only way I can relate to it is in that pure Žižekian way that I I've accepted my own alienation by the fact that even my name doesn't belong to me. I remember I was listening to the Why Theory podcast, and Ryan Engley was saying about, I think there was an example where Ryan Engley said about how he moved school and he didn't want to be put in a class with someone else called Ryan because his name belonged to him. Yeah. And I was always like, well, try having a name. Yeah. It will never be yours.
We were joking that it's first as farce, then as tragedy.
Yeah.
my friend works at a bar, and I was sitting on the counter. He was serving me, and it had the menu up behind the bar, and it said Austin Powers. I was like, why does it say Austin Powers up there? And he was like, that's the name of the guy that owns the bar. And I just thought that was the most deeply unfortunate name.
Yeah, I think there are worse names. We had remember the local tattoo artist in my town was called Harry Potter.
Oh,
worse, which is a lot worse, I think.
That is worse.
Apart from being called, I don't know, Adolf or I don't know, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Harry Ink Blotter or something.
Yeah.
Nice one. That's pretty good.
Thanks.
So you're a professor at Sheffield.
Yes, yeah, we don't. We're senior lecturer as well. Yeah,
senior lecturer.
You have to. I don't know, show blood to be a professor.
Okay.
And you teach physical, what is it?
Yeah, my background's really odd. So my background's actually in sport. So I teach in a sport department. When I say my background, my undergrad was in sport. So I teach as part of a sport department, but my research really from sort of my master's onwards has always been based around the media. So I've taught in media departments before. But obviously, when needed to get a job after PhD, ended up working at Sheffield Hallam in the sports department there. But I teach an intro to sociology and philosophy module as part of a physical education degree, and I also teach research methods as well. So even then, sort of my stuff isn't really explicitly sport anymore.
And so, how did you make the transition into writing about Žižek and psychoanalysis?
As I've been asked that before. It got to about, when would I start? I think I first started reading Žižek around I think it was about 2017, 2018. And between 2016 and 2018, I started reading Žižek, and it was purely a boredom out of social theory. But also he was a name that people kept saying, have you read this fella? Have you read Žižek and whatnot? And I think particularly he seemed to sort of escalate massively after 2010, I think, in sort of wider recognition. And I think that was when it's definitely sort of YouTube videos and whatnot. I do remember trying to read Plague of Fantasies during my PhD and just having to put it down because I thought this is crackers. I remember thinking that I'm just not mature enough to be reading this at the minute. So it was, I don't know if it was after that, it was always on the back of my mind. At some point, I thought I'm going to have to return to him. And then, but I started with the sublime object of ideology, and well, the world was never the same again.
Right.
I'm sure we've all had that experience.
Definitely.
For sure.
So like you've sort of honed in on comedy, and like when we're first coming into Žižek's work, I think one of the standout things about him is that he's funny and he tells jokes.
Yes. Yeah.
So like maybe you could talk a little bit about the role of comedy in Žižek's work.
Yes. Well, I think it's central, as you've sort of already highlighted there, and it's a key part. I think what I like about the comedy of Žižek is that on one level, it makes him very approachable, because he'll sort of, he'll start off with this joke. But the beauty of Žižek, and I find this, definitely a beauty to his work, and I'd say that deliberately, is that it performs what it is he's trying to say as part of the theory. So, for instance, if you're trying to understand concrete universal, if you're trying to understand dialectics, if you're trying to understand parallax, and then the numerous other terms and Lacanian terminology, as well as his own, that draw from that, you're sort of getting that in the example, the comic example. So I think I think when people struggle with Žižek, I think it's because they're expecting the introduction of I introduce this issue, here's an example, here's the critique of it. But that sort of gets jumbled up a little bit when Žižek gives stuff, because he'll sort of slam you with this example and then another example and then another example. And then by the end, you're like, oh, God, because this is what he's saying regarding, I don't know, dialectics or something along those lines. So you can't separate, I think, comedy from Žižek. And I think that works both for and against him in many ways as well.
Mm-hmm. It undermines the kind of seriousness that people tend to think of academics by. And then because of that, they almost want to dismiss him, because he's not serious enough.
Definitely. And the best, and I it's something that is integral to Žižek, but look at all of the good writers from his Lacanian school or whatnot. They all use comedies. Supanjic uses it. I mean, Todd McGowan sounds hilarious, I think, sometimes, when you're reading some of his examples and the way he draws upon stuff, sounds, he's using comedy, for those purposes. And so I think it's there. I think to be a good writer, you need to be a bit funny, which is a problem in my books. I often wonder it's not very funny. I'm using other people's jokes. I think the phenomenalness of someone like Todd McGowan is that he actually comes up with his own jokes as part, which to me is like the extra level of intelligence.
Well, maybe he's a dad. I don't know if you're a father, but maybe.
No, I'm not. No, that's probably.
I think the dad part's interesting, right? Like, if Žižek wasn't a dad, there's no way that he would be talking about Kung Fu Panda.
Yeah.
No, definitely. Yeah. And then although then the mystery of, has he watched it? I love that. I think it was in an interview where he was asked about what was it, the one about
Black Panther, I think.
Yeah, was it Black Panther, definitely. What was it's the one about blue people, David Cameron. Not David Cameron. Avatar, yeah. And I think he was like, no, good God, I've not watched that film.
It's like, I get the gist, whatever.
Yeah.
He doesn't want the movie to actually conflict with a good theory about it or something.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the point, right? Don't let reality interfere with a good theory.
Definitely.
Make reality apply to it.
And one of the claims of your book, one of the themes that you're exploring in your book, is that comedy actually has something to say about philosophy and subjectivity, even questions of ontology. So without just going all the way to the end, I mean, what can you say about comedy and philosophy, maybe?
Yeah, I think the two things, ontology and subjectivity, yes, I think comedy can definitely say something about. I think there's a bit in the book where I talk about I draw upon it specifically on the sections on parallax, where we talk about the one being divided. And I think what comedy does is it provides us, a good joke or a good comic performance provides a bit of a twist, or it exposes that gap that is therefore related to both the subject and ontology. So I remember, and I think that again comes back, I remember reading about the concrete universal before Alenka Štěpánčic's book on comedy, and not understanding it until I had her comic examples. And I think so that's the beauty, I think, and that's perhaps where I think that it helps philosophy.
Yeah, and that's where Žižek. Sorry, I'll let one of you guys jump in a sec, but that's where Žižek describes, the coincidence of concrete universal, always with a joke, like the Rabinovich joke, right?
Yep. Yes. Yeah.
The parallax, the shift in perspective of the joke. but also that shifting perspective being kind of an ontological claim. Like,
yes,
you made an interesting like comment on like the risk of a joke. And last summer we were talking about Žižek's book on Hegel and a Wired Brain, and
yes,
we were talking about how like we were having a kind of skepticism about if a computer could be funny, and that's almost an ontological claim because there needs to be kind of inconsistency in order for there to be a joke.
Yeah, there needs to be that inconsistency. Apologies, my cat wants to join in.
What's the little fellow's name?
Yeah, this is Kate.
Nice.
Cool. People always laugh at the name that we called her Kate, but her brother's called Sawyer. So I don't know if there's a TV reference there, which some people might get. Kate and Sawyer.
I thought it might be like a royal thing, you know, because
good God.
you have a dog named like the Dutch of Windsor or something. Like
Oh,
that.
good. No, Michael. No, unfortunately, that's a burden that I think me and Michael have to share in having the same head of state there.
Well, so do we. We're
Canadian, of course. Yes,
this is a Commonwealth experience we're sharing right now.
And we are expecting you to apologize.
Yeah. We'll all toast up. Sorry. The question. Sorry, what you were saying there about the computer. Well, see, that's an interesting. I remember hearing that when you spoke about it, and I thought, you know, can the computer ever get the inconsistency that I'm talking there about with regards to something being funny and that being sort of a comic mode? But then I suppose that again brings us back to this notion of the concrete universal, because a computer would be funny when its own lack of its own inability to display that inconsistency becomes performed, if you know what I mean. So I'm thinking
kind of a laugh at scenario rather than a laff with.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, like there was that one computer that was like I'm going to kill you or something like that.
Yeah, like right out. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And how that gets performed, I think, is quite interesting. So and I think this comes back to a lot of comment. I mean, if you think about the idea of Henri Bergson and stuff, when he talks about something I talk about a little bit in the book about the idea of someone acting machine-like is when they become funny. I mean, there's Modern Times, Charlie Chaplin. It is a funny scene. You have to giggle. I mean, I'm thinking here, Mark Zuckerberg comes across as one of the, as robotic. I mean, I do, to think of Terminator, I think he is sent from the
What's that gap between being machine-like and over-identification?
Yeah. I think
they're close.
Yes, I think it comes back to that minimal difference. I think if a machine, the subject is inconsistent, the subject is inherently that gap, that void. So I think that minimal difference, that comedy is therefore is inherent to the subject in that respect, and that through comedy the subject can be performed. Now, whether or not, at what point I think that gets reflected in the machines, I think is a really interesting example. There needs to always be a subject, I think, involved in some sort of way. The show wasn't great. You're probably aware of it, but there was a skit. There was a show in the UK called Little Britain, where the woman, I think the woman's working at a desk, and someone asks her something, and she'd be like, "Computer says no," because she's like putting the information into the computer, and then the comedy of the scene was that every reply would be the computer says no. So in the sense, she performed the computer's role through her own sort of her own sort of actions in that respect. So, I mean, can a computer ever be funny? Probably not, because it will always need that subject.
Another way I'm thinking comes to mind is like a lot of comedy has to do with the unexpected.
Yes.
But a computer, it's basically entirely oriented around what is predictable.
Yeah. Yeah. So what you're saying is timing, right?
Yeah.
Like where it gets punctuated.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's an unexpectedness that I think this is something, that Zupančič talks really well about, the idea of, of inconsistency. And it's an unexpectedness that was always expected, if that makes, I think that's the key. But it wasn't that something just came out of the blue and was funny. I think you knew it was there, but you didn't expect it, type thing. I think, and that's
because when someone is like really effusive and like trying to be funny, there's like the gap. It's like it seems to have like a put on. Whereas like if something kind of organically just like pops up and says it, and it makes sense within the new coordinates of the situation after you've told the joke.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the notion of retroactivity would be really interesting. I think the fact that it perhaps re-symbolizes what would be a good example. I think that relates quite nicely to ideas. The idea of trying to be funny is something that I think conservative comedy is, the false comedy might.
Maybe you could get into the distinction there actually between like what you call false and true comedy, or are those Zupančič's?
These are
Zupančič,
Zupančič's. Yeah. This is a complete and utter. Yeah, the book. I think I said this in almost every interview I've done. Don't go read Alenka's book first, and then because Alenka's is. I read hers, and it was the only, and then this book.
Yeah, well, we actually tried booking her first.
Right. Okay.
It's okay.
What about Todd's book on comedy, Jack?
Say again. Sorry.
Todd's book on comedy.
Yes.
So you read Zupančič's.
Oh, that's sorry. Apologies. Yes. Then so I read Zupančič's and then I read Todd's.
And they hadn't done it well enough, so you take a crack at it.
Well. You know what bothers me? Like, so I am. I wouldn't be able to work without Todd McGowan's work or thinking. The man is brilliant. Someone said to me on Twitter the other day that he delivers bangers like he's commented upon the weather or something or other.
Yeah.
This is an extremely pro Todd McGowan podcast. I want to make that entirely clear.
I thought as much. I'm in good company. But the one thing that I would love to, and I've never met Todd McGowan, I've never spoken to him. Perhaps this is a slight attempt to notice me, Todd, please.
Todd, if you're out there, we love you. Jack loves you.
Tally lessons, but
is Todd never mentions the concrete universal in any of his writing on universality.
Really?
And he provides.
Yeah, I did it today.
Well, you noticed it that.
No, I searched through all of his work today.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's really surprising.
And he has a comment on Zupančič's book in his book on comedy, and it's quite. If I remember rightly, I read his book on comedy a while back. It was. I think it's more of a critique, and he sort of skips past it quite quickly. So for me, it was a case of, you've got this one great book, Alenka Zupančič's book on comedy, and you've got another great book, Todd McGowan's. But I think they're disparate. They don't work in that respect. They're not. So I think my book, if anything, was trying to. I'm not trying to say I'm trying to bring those two authors together because they are inherently together. But I always found that odd. Why the lack of the concrete universal. And obviously, Todd McGowan was making the argument. He focuses more on lack and excess, which is obviously something that I use in the book as well. But to me, it can be used alongside the concrete universal. I think we can probably move on to this later. I think this comes out in the relationship between the master signifier and the universal, which obviously Todd McGowan's written a lot on.
Cool. So maybe we can revisit the concept of true and false comedy.
Yes. So these are distinctions that Alenka Zupančič uses, and essentially, false comedy follows a conservative path. So and true comedy doesn't do that. True comedy, I suppose, in many respects, is more radical, or perhaps, to use a bigger word, more emancipatory in those instances. So when she makes this distinction between true and false comedy, she draws fundamentally to the baron who slipped in a puddle or a banana peel or whatnot. And this is the sort of the joke that a baron is walking along the pavement. Say, he slips on a banana peel, he falls into a puddle. Ha ha ha! The baron is just like everybody else. Any human being can walk along the path, slip on the banana peel, and and look silly. And that's an example of what she says is false comedy, because she says the true comedy is not the fact that he can fall in a puddle just like everybody else, and we can all share in comedy. It's the fact that he gets up and still walks and gets up, dusts himself down, and carries on walking along the pavement, believing he is a baron in that. So so the comedy lies in the fact that he presumptuously believes he is a baron. So it's the baron title, which is the comic, the sense of comedy there. So true comedy comes out there in the baron, in laughing at the universal title, the baron. That's what's funny, the fact that we have barons, or that somebody would believe themselves to be a baron.
Yeah,
right.
So with the baron, that he's not a baron, but does he know that he's not a baron?
Right. Yes. Yeah.
That's where the comedy ensues, right?
Exactly. Yes. And I think this comes out, you see this, she relates it a lot, obviously, I think her book was written 2008, I think. And she relates it a lot to like George W. Bush, that George, it became a bit of a media strategy for him to make these mistakes because people thought, poor old George making another mistake. But the comedy was the fact that, this was a president making. This was a man who believed himself to be a president. This was the man who had, the keys to the nuclear bombs and whatnot. that's what makes him, the fact that he was the president is the comedy there. I mean,
right. Well, we wanted to.
We live this in the UK with Boris Johnson at the minute. The Tories love to make, haha, you silly old fool, Boris Johnson, but the man's the prime minister. Good God, like that's the real funny bit.
Yeah. Well, speaking of barons and presidents, President Trump, is there like, because before we were talking, we were trying to like deconstruct like exactly what is funny about Trump, and like there is that element of conservative comedy or false comedy about him, but there is also a very ambiguous relationship that he has with comedy because he himself is funny.
Yeah,
and
that we have in being spectators to that.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering maybe the line between like can we think of like false comedy being like is comedy only to be seen as either true or false? Is there comedy like in general, and then maybe it can also be understood in those ways, and can false comedy be, if it's seen from a different perspective, be true comedy in a sense?
I think and that's a great point to make, because I think I even say in the book, I did not want the book to be, this is good comedy, this is bad comedy in any way. And I think, when you start talking about true comedy and false comedy, I think you fall into perhaps the habit of saying this is good and this is bad. And I don't think Alenka Shupanjic is doing that either when she employs those terms. I think you're right. I think there might be some sort of general form of comedy, but what I think the true and false comedy distinctions draw attention to is they lay up the concrete universal in that respect. They show you, they provide a way of entering in to see how these universal notions become concretized, to use the phrases there, how it's the inconsistency of the universal that is performed through a particular example, which is really interesting. I mean, Trump's like you said, he has this quite brilliant relationship to a certain extent with comedy, because I found myself laughing at Trump, from the things he said before. The favorite one, and again, this is why I think comedy is great. It gives us these examples to sit back and analyze. And I can't remember if I used this example before, but I remember when they were talking about, I think it was when Meghan and Harry had gone to the US, and Meghan had done something mental that everybody thought was regarded as against, this slight against the royal family. And they asked Donald Trump for his opinion, and his reply was, all I would say to Harry is good luck. Which is like the most horrifically as if to be like, good luck with that woman type thing. The most horrifically sexist, misogynist thing to say. I think I heard it on the radio, and it was one of those where I stopped and laughed and then was like, oh God. I'm laughing at Donald Trump. But I think there was something, I'd go as far to say I think the best royal we've ever had, and I'm a Republican here, is Harry, that ironically, in leaving the royal family, he's become more of a royal in that respect. So I don't know, perhaps, good luck, Harry, because half there. I think perhaps there's some truth there in Donald Trump's.
And of course, Harry wouldn't be anything worthy of noticing if he wasn't himself a royal, the very thing he's trying to get away from.
Exactly.
Nice.
Yeah, there's probably some. I always thought there's a good Hegelian, when Hegel talks about the monarch and whatnot, signaling the contradiction. I always thought, my God, have we reached that point with Harry Windsor?
Right.
But I can be a monarchist through Harry, perhaps.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You don't watch the American Office, do you? Or you haven't?
No.
Okay.
No, I know that's an error on my behalf, because because people often, that always comes because obviously the book focuses specifically on the UK one.
Of course.
But I'm aware of it. I do think the first two seasons of the US Office closely follow the UK one. So I always wondered if this was replicated, because obviously the joke I analyse in the book is from the second season of the first episode of the UK. So I always wondered if there was a sort of comparable example.
Can you theorize the repetition?
I think that idea of something. I think the repetition there would be interesting, is if it is repeated.
In a way, it is actually.
Right.
Michael tries to do the Chris Rock bit about brothers and N-words.
Right.
And he starts imitating Chris Rock's voice, and then actually does the joke.
Yes. Right. Okay.
And then gets in trouble for it, and it's the whole like human resources thing, and similarly. And the way it works.
So is there the entrance? Is it the same? Do you still, because obviously the comedy of the UK episode is the fact that Oliver, the black colleague, enters
I think there is a
black
new
right.
black.
See, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. I remember hearing the example. I think it's interesting that the Chris Rock example there's used, because I remember again to refer to another podcast. Apologies, but I think in the Why Theory episode where they talk about comedy, Tom McGowan draws upon the example of Zach Galifianakis, who went up to Chris Rock and admired Chris Rock, but just so his idea was to go up to Chris Rock and say the most racist joke that he could think of. But I think that fails. I think that's different to what perhaps gets performed in The Office, because you've essentially just got a white man there telling the black man his racist joke, which I think is not what happens in the scenes.
That's true. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Which is interesting, but yeah, I think they use it as an example of why racist comedy can't be used, and I'm a bit like, oh, I don't know. I think it can with these sort of theoretical.
Right. Maybe in just to explain to flesh out the earlier dichotomy we were drawing between false and true comedy. Maybe we could speak to true comedy in that sense.
Yes, yeah, because like comedy is, like your book is trying to get to this thing that comedy is doing, right? Like it's not just that a joke is funny.
Yes.
Right?
No. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's if it's just funny for certain reasons, then it can be itself kind of counterproductive in terms of what we might think of as the subversion of comedy.
No, definitely. So I think so the true comedy is essentially, my interpretation of it is essentially the concrete universal and how that's enacted. Now, I think this is perhaps, my guess would be that perhaps one of the reasons why Todd McGowan doesn't use the concrete universal is I think he's spoken and written quite critically before about against subversion, against how subversion, and I can see where he's getting at, because subversion essentially means you kind of, it's there in his critique of the master signifier in Lacau's work, that to subvert something, you need to accept that it exists, if you know what I mean. So you're kind of accepting its power. And then do you ever really escape from its power? Because that's kind of how ideology works, is it always leaves that space for itself to be subverted. And I think that's something I've sort of theoretically gone backwards and forwards with, because for me, there is a value in true comedy. And then what it enacts is this concrete universal where through a particular example, the universal is shown to be false, or the universal is shown to be driven by a particular perspective. So I think whereas Todd McGowan, I 100% agree, talks about the universal being an absence, and it's sharing what we don't have. We share the absence, so to speak. I think that what comedy is good is it does have this subversive potential, because it shows the ridiculousness of a particular perspective, a particular opinion. It shows how this universal notion is founded upon what it excludes, and that's an important part of it.
Yeah.
It's inclusion. One thing I use in the book to try and elaborate upon this a bit more, and again, this is where I find it difficult to. This is where I try and align perhaps Lenkeshwar Pandit's concrete universal and Todd McGowan's work, is that Todd McGowan, he talks about it in his book, but he'd written it on a paper as well. He compares Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton.
Yeah.
And I think the interesting thing there is, whereas Charlie Chaplin is excluded from the social order, he's the tramp, so to speak, and that's where the comedy lies. Buster Keaton's comedy comes from his included exclusion. So Buster Keaton often succeeds within the social order, but it's through his success he's never fulfilled. He's always excluded as part of it. So I think there's an example where he achieves, I think it's in one of his films where he achieves some sort of status and he can finally kiss the girl, but he can never kiss the girl because he's got to shake everybody's hands because he's achieved status.
Yeah. The general, that's it. Yes. Yeah. So the comedy there is from the fact that he's included, but he's excluded. And for me, that's a good example. That's what I was kind of getting at with the concrete universal, that it provides that sort of parallax, that change of perspective, that where, you can start to see that there are false universals. And I think that's where I sort of made the link there with political correctness. The political correctness is false.
The false universal being identity, for instance.
Yes, yeah, or a false universal being driven by a particularity.
Okay, right, a particular identity, maybe.
Yeah, so So you get focused. So the particular is masquerading as a universal there, and I agree that
using the Hegelian, terms there, that we end up with the singular universal. But for me, I like this idea that to get to the singular universal, this point of absence, you need the concrete universal there first. And it's that which sort of, I know.
Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah. Between McGowan and Zupančič.
Yeah. So, the universal was brought back down to earth in Zupančič's work through the concrete universal.
Do we maybe have an example? So the example that you're drawing on is the racist joke in The Office. Maybe we should explain that to tie that together.
Yeah. So it's, as I said, it's episode 1 of season 2. And just, a bit of context to the episode. This episode, I think it's called Merger. It is called Merger. And what you've got the Slough branch, which is where David Brent works, played by Ricky Gervais, and it's merging with another branch from the country. So they're sort of merging these two branches together. And as part of the episode, Ricky Gervais, as the manager of these two branches now, has to do a bit of an introduction, a talk to them all. And obviously, because it's David Brent, he comes with he thinks he's a comedian. Mm-hmm. He wants to put on, a bit of a comedy show as part of it. So I think in the original, so there's 4 scenes where this gets played out, which I analyze in the book. And in the first scene, he talks about, he's saying how he's going to do he's got some jokes in there. He's talking to Gareth and Tim. And it's the scenes involving those 3 characters, obviously 3 white men. And Gareth says, I've got a joke you can use. And then that's when he begins to tell the joke. And the joke is that the royal family, Christ, was that the 3rd time royal family's been mentioned in this? But
this is actually also a royalist podcast.
Yes, yeah, it will. So the royal family are playing, I think, is it 20 questions or something at Christmas? And, one person thinks of something and you've got to get to what they're thinking of within 20 questions. And the sort of the nature of the joke is that the Queen is thinking about a black man's cock, and everybody asks a different question. And I think, is it bigger than the bread bin? Can I put it in my mouth? And then by the 3rd, and without any delay, the Queen says, "Oh, is it a black man's cock?" So you get clearly a racist joke performed, and you get that performed by Gareth to Ricky, to David Brent and Tim, the other character. And then it carries on. And I think it's the repetition of it over the next few scenes, which becomes really crucial and really important, because when you've got Gareth, the joke's clearly racist. I remember watching that episode live when I was younger and, uncomfortable because I knew it was a racist joke. And David Brent saying, is it racist type thing? And he's clearly looking at the camera. He's trying to perform a politically correct performance. By finding, but he also therefore finds the joke very, very funny, clearly. So he does his stand-up routine, it fails, and then he's basically, after that, they're sort of milling about in the office, sharing drinks, sort of meeting each other and discussing. And because his comic routine was such a failure, he goes, "This is a joke I should have used." And he therefore tells the racist joke. So he's sort of intelligent enough to know not to use the joke in the actual performance he gives, but then he repeats it to a group of colleagues as part of this second scene. And then
the postmodern boss move, in a way.
Yes. Yeah. Look, guys, this is what I should have told you.
Yeah.
And then just before he says the punchline, when he repeats the joke, Oliver, the black colleague, sort of enters the group and he immediately stops. And he's sort of like, he won't say the punchline. So you're laughing at the fact Oliver appears. Yeah. You're laughing at the fact he's awkward in saying it. Yeah. And the parallax, the concrete universal was enacted, in my opinion, in that second scene where you get Oliver, say, "Well, were you telling a joke?" And everybody says, "Yeah, that was it." And someone said, "Well, what was the punch? What was the punchline?" And everybody goes, "Oh no, that doesn't need to be said." And I think something else is said, and Oliver says, "Oh, is it the one about the royal family?" He goes, "Oh, it's the one about the black man's cock." So he sort of finishes the joke.
Yeah, and it's almost repeating the Queen in how fast he gets the punchline of the joke.
Yeah. So these layers of repetition in it are really funny. I think what's interesting there is it's coming. I think this is what I meant earlier when you said there about the unexpected, is that we've already heard the joke. We know what's going to happen. And all we actually get is this. All we actually really get is the black man finished the joke to that extent, and then it's carried on as David Brent. Then the funniness comes from the fact that he's like, well done, good, thank you for finishing the joke, and well done for not finding it racist type thing. And then that gets played out, and then there's 2 subsequent scenes after that which then play out his sort of him trying to defend the joke as not being racist.
And I think an example you also use is like the joining between the particular and the universal there is like there's the instance of telling the joke, and yet when the colleague enters, it's like the entrance of this kind of the kind of specter of racism, playing out.
Yeah. So for me, I think the universal is played out there in that David Brent thinks he's being politically correct. He congratulates Oliver on telling the joke. He carries on thinking that he is politically correct. He carries on thinking that the joke's funny. I suppose Oliver in that respect is the slip in the puddle, the fact he enters and he's able to finish the joke.
Right.
So what you're laughing at in the joke is not necessarily, you're not laughing at the black man. You're not laughing at the racist joke. You're laughing at David Brent's presumptuousness, his idea that he believes he's being politically correct.
Yeah, and that his performance of political correctness.
Yes.
So it's like we're laughing at the Baron or something, right?
Yeah. Which, yes, you're laughing. You're laughing at, you're laughing at the Baron thinking he's a Baron. You're laughing at David Brent thinking he's performing his political correctness. Now, for me, that was just, when I was able to make those connections, I thought, well, this is quite unique because I'm not, political correctness is a swamp that you can either, you're either politically correct or you're not politically correct. And it gets brilliantly used by the right. They manage to control that because it's a debate about particularity, about identity, like you said. And what this did was showed how something like political correctness can be subverted without losing political correctness. I think that's,
without being racist. Like you can laugh at it without being racist.
Yeah.
I've recently been watching Nathan For You. Have you seen that?
No, I haven't. No, is that new or?
It came out in like the early, for like 2012 to 2015, something like that.
Right.
Highly recommend.
Highly recommend that.
What's it called? Nathan For You.
Yeah. It's without going too far into it. It's a guy, this Canadian Jewish guy from Vancouver who, he graduated from business school with, in his words, with really good grades. He sort of comes up with these crackpot schemes to make businesses more popular, and not more profitable, but more popular. Like he has this this very expressed need to be loved by people and to be seen as a good person and as a worthy person of their affection. There's this one where he's trying to get more business for a nail salon, and he thinks that if they have a valet service, then they'll draw more customers in. But he notices that when he's using the estheticians, are they the nail people? Anyway, the people that do the nails, he's doubling them as valets. These Asian women, and he notices that the women who are coming to get their nails done seem to not really trust these Asian women behind the wheel of their car.
Clear I would have to do something to change these customers' long-held beliefs. So I went online and found an Asian stunt driver named Farina May who could do some pretty impressive stuff with a car. And I felt that if she could stand in as one of our valets, customers would finally see the truth about what Asians can do behind the wheel.
Yeah.
In his eyes, this is a wonderfully sort of liberal, multiculturalist thing that he's doing. He's showing people the error of their ways by this great example of driving excellence. So he hires a stunt driver and he's talking to her and he thinks that, sorry, this is going on a long time.
Carry on, keep going. I was worried about that one. This is why we need to go watch these examples if anyone was listening.
You're explaining this really well, Will.
Yeah, no, keep going. I feel like we're getting
here's the punchline. So he thinks that to fully sell this, the stunt driver that he's hired, who's an American woman, should have an Asian accent. And so she's like, I'm not really sure what you mean by an Asian accent. And he's like, okay, well, I mean, if you want, I can show you. But before I do this, he starts to do this whole song and dance that lasts for like an absurdly long. It's like a third of the joke. It's him doing this whole thing about how he doesn't want to offend her and he's not racist and that he's not sure if this is actually it is, but maybe blah, blah, blah. And she's like, okay, give it a shot. And then he just comes out with the most over-the-top racist impression of an Asian person you can possibly imagine. And it's hilarious.
Yeah.
Right? And at first it's like, okay, is this a racist joke? Right? But it's clearly not. What he's doing, I think, is what you're pointing out, is showing the contradictions and limits of like the purely multiculturalist, like sort of acceptance, like, oh, if we can just have the representation of the drivers and everything will be cured.
Yeah, that sounds like a brilliant example. I think what you said there about this idea of it being, clearly a false universal is being enacted there when you said there about how you're trying to show that even everybody can be good. Look, we're all good drivers under this false universal that we can all be good drivers. Mm-hmm. Is it? I think this was again the beauty of drawing upon someone like Todd McGowan and Alenka Stupanjic. I mean, the excess there. So Todd McGowan says that the comedy occurs when you get the conjunction of lack and excess. So when the two meet. So I think what's interesting there is if you had an excessive gesture, if you had say for instance you had somebody excessively perform a racist stereotype, then there's two ways that can go, because yes, obviously it's clearly racist, but perhaps there's something there about the fact that from their own lack of awareness, that's where the comedy lies. There's that lack of awareness from the Baron that to be a Baron is ridiculous.
Right.
There's that lack of awareness in David's excessiveness to, that's the reason why I examined the 4 scenes, because the joke, the funny stuff happens in the first 2, but in the 3rd and 4th, he excessively maintains this. It's not racist. Keep going. It's not racist. It's fine, type thing. And he ends up making more politically incorrect jokes through the process. So he ends up making a homosexual joke. He ends up, I think at one point, he's saying to him, he wants to know who found the joke racist, type thing, and it turns out it's a white woman. He's like, well, that's you can't because you're not black.
Yeah, right.
yeah. Woman in the wheelchair.
Yeah, the woman in the wheelchair. Have you seen this
the guy with the withered hand?
Yes, yeah, so you get so it never stops. So I think it's, again, perhaps there's something there about his lack of awareness is what makes the performance of the racist stereotype.
Right.
So to understand, it's a racist stereotype. So it's racism. I'm not denying that racism obviously doesn't exist, but it's to see the split. I think it's that inconsistency as well, which is really important there. I always had at the back of my mind, I remember a sort of social psychologist in the UK, Michael Billig, did something similar where he explored racist jokes, and he went to KKK websites and analysed the racist jokes on a KKK website, and his big conclusion was they're racist. And I was just always like, well,
Shocking.
yes, if we're going to find racism, we'll find it on the KKK website. but that was like getting into a sort of bad and good, pile
right?
of
yeah.
bad jokes, and I was like, yeah, they are bad, and perhaps we should therefore just ignore them and never repeat those ones. But there are opportunities perhaps to show where comedy can enact this power, like this.
I like how in that Nathan Fielder joke, how it kind of displays what actually you pointed out as Žižek's point about the kind of patronizing attitude of white liberals who nonetheless sort of maintain their role in power. They sort of just purely by identifying the fact that there's racism, he can proceed with his own, in this case, extremely exaggerated.
And the brilliant ending to it is he gets her to try it, and then she starts doing an imitation of the accent as well.
So it's an Asian woman imitating.
Yeah, she's an American Asian woman doing an imitation of an Asian woman,
right?
With a very similar voice that he did.
Right. So that's the minimal diff. Yeah, this sounds like a brilliant example.
Yeah.
The minimal difference, the sort of the same but not the same type thing.
And shows maybe the limits of basing a comedy on identity. And I also wanted to ask, like, okay, so we've talked about false, true, and then maybe emancipatory, or like an example of like how to kind of subvert the notion of a racist joke. But what about politically correct comedy? Like, I almost understand that as false comedy, but I'm just wondering what you would think of that.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I suppose it's what you're defining as politically correct comedy. And I think
what's okay. We actually, before Michael, Hannah
Gadsby.
Did you know this Netflix special? And it was really popular a year or two ago. And basically all she does on stage is moralize for like an hour and a half.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's like extremely unfunny.
Yes. Yeah.
Because everything she's saying is what she should be saying.
Okay. Yeah. And we can freely say that on this podcast, but does it come with a sense that if you criticize her, you're in some way wrong yourself?
Big time.
Yeah. We have something.
I'm thinking that as we speak. I'm horrified.
Will is leaning back.
I'm going to leave.
We have something similar in the UK called The Last Leg, which is a Channel 4, which is actually, his name's gone from my mind, but it's hosted by an Australian comedian. And it's essentially, it's three fellas, two of them are disabled. And it's like a Friday sort of, a Friday night Channel 4 comedy where they sort of make fun of the week. So I suppose it's similar to like a John Oliver type show from the US, or I can't remember how many they are now, all the other ones and whatnot.
They as a sidebar, which you have come out saying you don't get John Oliver, you don't like John Oliver.
John Oliver, Jon Stewart, Colbert.
The thing is, what is it about those guys that you think might be? I think we can call that false comedy, couldn't we?
Yeah, I think they're unfunny for the same reason. Yeah.
That'd be your political correct. They would be politically correct.
Yeah, exactly.
It's exactly the same. It's sort of it's just I don't know. Yeah, it's moralizing. It falls into that trap of making fun of politicians in a sense that politicians quite like. And it keeps them in power. For me, it's brilliantly performed more recent, not necessarily it is a comic performance, would be in the film, Don't Look Up, where you've got Mark Rylance performing as an amalgamation of Zuckerberg, Bezos, Elon Musk, and everybody on that Twitter was like, wow, what a wonderful performance, Mark Rylance and everything. And it's a terrific performance and it's very funny to watch, but they like that. As I said, I think if you're laughing at them, then they're winning, if that makes sense. You need to be laughing at the fact that laughing at the fact that someone like Elon Musk is in that position, not Elon Musk.
He could be someone else.
Yeah, that's a great
point. Have a billionaire.
And something I wanted to add was like, it's almost as if those sorts of approaches to comedy don't trust the audience to not be racist. So they have to just so everyone is very aware, we're supposed to laugh at this, so we're not supposed to laugh at that. It doesn't trust the interpretation. Whereas the racist joke, take the risk of it is that it could either be understood or could not be understood.
Yeah, so it requires a position. I think even more of a position than what the politically correct position is trying to put you in, type thing.
Oh yeah.
So it comes across as neutral, I suppose, that politically correct. It was politically neutral, despite the fact it make a political point.
Yeah, for example, all the late night shows in the U.S. are basically like completely in lockstep with the Democratic Party.
Yes, yeah.
Which is funny, right? Because with the White House Correspondents' Dinners, the idea about it being politically neutral, it was only under Trump that he wouldn't attend those White House Correspondents' Dinners.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah.
The only other person was Nixon because he'd been shot. And I think it was Clinton, and they got Aretha Franklin as a performer instead of a comedian.
That's interesting.
So that idea of being able to take a joke, to not take yourself seriously, there has to be some minimal withdrawal, like some minimal distance between you and your identity, or you and your symbolic mandate.
Yeah,
which Trump was not able to.
But I actually think that it was a interesting move that he didn't do it, because it was like an overt recognition that what was happening there, for in every other instance, like Obama being a good example, was total false comedy.
And in a way, like that position, symbolic position, which sort of elbows you and winks, like Žižek talks about with the sergeant, the drill sergeant, or the military commander who makes the dirty jokes and thus sort of maintains his role, maintains the structure of that situation through those kinds of like minor subversions and jokes, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, because the idea is that if you can participate in some sort of transgressive joke, you create a community. What was the word they used? It was like mirth or something, like the idea that when you tell a joke, it produces a kind of intimacy in its audience.
Yes.
Jack?
Yeah. So I think this is quite an interesting example. So you've got, I think this might be some of the danger. This might be some of perhaps the danger in the argument I make that someone like McGowan might point to, is that we'd have to be on the side of Trump, wouldn't we? Surely, for not attending.
Yeah.
but Trump isn't not attending in order to show the ridiculousness of the event. He's doing it because he's trying to maintain
basically personal reasons. Like
that he probably
been treated very unfairly.
Yeah, he wouldn't be able to. He wouldn't be able to handle
the most unfair.
Yeah, so he wouldn't be able to handle that.
Unfair.
So the comedy becomes the event, not. I think.
Maybe some other category exists where you can find Trump, disgusting, but also find that funny, and it's just a hard gray area, like you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's what happened with me when he said the joke there about Harry. Good luck. He didn't. It came out. No, it didn't. It didn't really make sense. In like he was being asked on like, and he just went. All I would say to Prince Harry is good luck with that. Good. You're gonna have a. And perhaps that's that dangerous sort of awkward zone it puts you in. But it actually says more, I think, perhaps in that regard. But the Murph example you drew upon, I think, is a really interesting one because I think that's something. I mean, that comes out with sort of Žižek often refers to that, the idea, that you share a dirty joke in order to create some form of mirth or camaraderie. And I think, I think that's something I've sort of lived with. I've experienced that throughout my life, that even, you might have pet names for each other and whatnot, but, the closest one to you can use that funny pet name. But if, for instance, a random person was to say it, it'd be the ultimate offense. So I think that gets lost a little bit. It gets lost in the politically correct arguments, but it also gets lost, I think, a bit more in general comedy studies.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to ask one question. You touched on it earlier, but it's a word that you use, but in the book, subversive, and you've already you mentioned how Todd sort of draws some skepticism about that term. But it's like I think it kind of, for me at least, it does have a lot to do with how we think about comedy. Is that like, can we use a word? I think you mentioned a word like emancipatory or like radical. I mean, what would that look like in terms of comedy? Is it just these examples that are sort of re-articulated, sort of parallaxed through this different interpretation, or is it a different kind of comedy?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think the way I've I've often thought that. So I've often thought like you have this great comedy example which shows everything, shows you the concrete universal. It subverts, you've just given that example there from the TV show, which brilliantly, through the performance of a racist stereotype, not only undermines the stereotype, but also undermines, say, the politically correct initiative that they were trying to do. But I suppose what you're getting at there is where does that leave us with? Like, what are we left with in that moment? I think that's beyond a different perspective on what came before. I think that's where I would bring it back to some sort of retroactive resignification that what come before has never been the same again. I watched that, the joke, the David Brent, the Office joke that I analysed. I remembered it, and up until I wrote the book, I'd never forgotten that racist joke. So I think it re-signified, how we approach and how we think about later on when I had the theoretical language to do so. But it re-signified, what we were talking about there. And I think, it's exposing that absence. I think this is something that, Todd McGowan often talks about, to refer to him again, is this idea that the universal becomes apparent in the absence. But the second it becomes apparent, then we've lost it type thing. So it's a fight for the universal through absence, through negation.
Right. So I guess in distinction from like having a good moral or something, or like teaching you something out of a joke, there's this like emphasis on the formal elements of a joke that can kind of transform our perception of a given situation.
It would teach you nothing.
Our role in a situation or something.
Right. But it would teach you nothing. But nothing's the same anymore. But you've learned something. I think this is something that particularly like applications of psychoanalysis are fantastic at. It's this idea, this idea of the impossible, this idea of. I think it's there a little bit. It's something I've working on another project. I think it's there a little bit in Robert Faller's notion of interpassivity. Mm-hmm. Sort of like you share this space where nothing's really changed, but everything's changed in that moment. You've got a different theoretical outlook. You've got a different idea. I think to come back to this idea that, who needs reality when you've got a good theory? That to me that is what a good comedy or true comedy would enact, is that.
Yeah. And
surely because your theory's changed on it. You're not even thinking in the same way anymore.
Yeah. And surely that shift in understanding reality, the world via comedy is itself a kind of emancipatory act.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Enjoy the music for a minute.
By the way, I don't think we said it, but your writing is very clear, and you have a lot of ease with the concepts, and you can sort of like condense them very well, which is a rare talent, I think, with these things.
Great. Wow, brilliant! Thanks, boys.
Yeah, really enjoyed.
Said that, because that's. Thank you ever so much.
Yeah, thanks for lending us so much time. It was really great talking to you.
No worries. Good. Yeah, I'll speak to you soon. Whatever.
Yeah, soon.
Stay in contact.
Cheers, Jack.
Very soon.
Yeah. Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers, mate.